Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The module that we are going to discuss today is the idea of human rights in the paper Social and Political Philosophy, and this module is written by J. Drydick from Carleton University. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. Let us begin the discussion about this module or this topic with the fundamental issue regarding the relation between human being and rights. Are rights always equated with human beings and sometimes extended to others, or right is a larger category and human right is one aspect of this larger category? So that is a question that is open for discussion. There are people who argue in favor of the first one, saying that there is an intrinsic relation between human being and rights, and there are people who look at the relation between human being and rights as one of part and whole. So what we will be discussing today in this module is what kind of things are rights? What should be included under human rights? That's the major thrust of this module. Rights are held by right holders. So when you talk about rights, there is somebody who holds that rights. So there are two kinds of holders that we generally talk about. One is that individual is a rights holder. There are also collectives, and collective rights holders are also there. And by extension, we also talk about community rights, we talk about animal rights, we talk about material rights and various things. So that's one thing that comes under the purview of human rights. The second thing that comes under the purview of human rights is what are the objects and substance and scope of human rights? What does human right consist of? What is its scope? The object of human right is it enables us to do something. So what is a human right and what does it ask us? What is the substance of human rights? The answer is it enables us to do certain things. So it is something that is a quality or tool that enables us to do certain things. See, the other important point that comes under human rights is it gives people certain entitlements. Like for instance, I have a right for education means that I as a human being who possess right is entitled, I can demand that give me education because you said that education is a right. Okay, health is a right. Okay, welfare is a right. Property is a right. Okay, security is a right. Freedom is a right. So there are a lot of things, if they are given to us, then I can demand because I am entitled to this. So that's why you cannot ask this question that why should you ask for giving you education from state? The answer is because state gave us a right for education. Since it offered right for education, it entitles that I get this right from the state. So I am entitled to this. This is my right to ask the state to give me education. Similarly, about the freedom from interference, and it gives me security. I possess property, and then I am guaranteed that state will protect my property. And there is also other issue where I have a freedom to express myself, and others have no freedom to interfere in my personal affairs. So all these things come under the purview of human rights. So they can be easily listed under human rights. The other important point that concerns human rights is the duty bearers. Okay? Now, the question that we ask under this head is, if I have a property rights, does it entail me to have duties? For instance, can non-owners be allowed to interfere with owners who possess? And the answer obviously is no. The reason why the answer is no is because I have a right to property and others have a duty not to interfere with my property. So possession and rightful use of their property is one of the important aspects of human rights. Now, I can ask, for instance, that if suppose there is a state that promises fair trial, okay, there is some grievance, I have a grievance and I go to the court, and the reason why I go to the court is that the court offers me a fair trial. But suppose for some reasons this fair trial is not provided, then I can immediately complain and can allege that the state that promises me a fair trial lacks credibility, and it can be held responsible for promising something and not meeting what is promised. So that is a very important thing. That's why we ask that there are duty bearers. Like there is a duty of the state to protect the rights of individuals, because rights are given to individuals by the state. So there is also another aspect which is very important that is associated with human rights is universality. Okay, for instance, somebody can say that you have a right to protect your property. Fine. But suppose somebody is given a right to education as a right, but then they will say that some people are not entitled for that kind of a right. So that is a contradiction. So when you make something as a right, there is a universality associated with it. Okay, all the people who come under that domain are entitled. So it does not, from this, one should not think that there is no discrepancy between what is promised and what is practiced. There can be a discrepancy. We'll come to that later in this module. What is important to keep in mind is that there should be universality in terms of the purview of the right that is extended to people. You cannot say that you have a right for education, but some people cannot go to school. That is not allowed. If you say that you have a right for education, all people who come under the purview of that have a right for that kind of thing which was extended to them. There are some examples, as I said, and just now, there are some exceptions. It is not that everything will go smoothly in these things. There are some exceptions. The exception can be in the form of, for instance, I have a free speech. I have a right to express myself. At the same time, I have to obey the intellectual property rights. Okay? I can't steal other people's view and then express them freely. So there is an exception. There are several exceptions like that. But the overall argument of the human rights discourse is that if rights are extended, there is a universality that accompanies the human rights. The other important aspect that is associated with human rights is the great weight that is rested with human rights. Human rights are trumps that must prevail when they conflict with other interests or even other rights. For instance, I have a property right. That is, I have a right to property, but does not mean that I will not pay tax. Okay, when the state asks me to pay the tax, that overrides my right over property. I have to pay tax even though property right is given to me. Okay, the other important aspect of the human right is there's a full range of duties to uphold. There's things such as respecting, protecting, fulfilling. So the question that we can ask in this context is, can rights be upheld without imposing this full range of duties? That can I have right without respecting other things, without protecting things, without fulfilling from the promises that is given to me? See, take this example that if I have a property and somebody interferes with my property, should state interfere and punish the person who infringes on my property, or just leave it to me? Okay, the libertarians would say that state should not interfere with my affairs. So because interference involves intervention, and intervention will go against the autonomy of individualism. So this is the point. But then the problem with this argument of the libertarians who ask for non-interference and extreme autonomy is that it makes other people to intervene. If other people don't intervene, then it looks as if it is left to me and I may not be able to protect my property. Okay, so it is in this context one also looks at, for instance, human rights as moral guarantees. Okay, what is the problem with this aspect of human rights? In order to understand this, we have to begin with the point, namely that human rights have a long history. It is not that rights just came the other day and then we started talking about human rights. No, there is a long history where the rights started taking different stages. The first phase, if roughly speaking, the first phase is a phase where the idea of right, the idea of human right was formulated. It was not that easy for human rights to be formulated. It is not that everybody accepted human rights as they perhaps may accept today. At that time, that was not something that was easily acceptable. It came to be accepted subsequently, but the first phase was the phase where there was an idea, that idea was postulated, though not practiced at that time. There is a second phase where this idea gained recognition. The idea gave recognition and states started committing through different laws, through treatises, and they also started promising to enforce it. In fact, they started enforcing it. This is the second phase of human rights. The third phase of human rights is that it is not only accepted, formulated, accepted and enforced, it is also respected. It is also sought to be protected. There was this attempt to fulfill through law and government the enforcing of human rights, proliferation of human rights. But in this context, we also should remember there are several instances where human rights were not met, not honored. There are cases where there are failed instances where the state failed to enforce human rights. So if you look at the human rights as a moral guarantor, it covers all these three phases. Now, with the rise of the recognition and state interference, there is often a feeling amongst scholars to ask and reflect, are human rights nothing but legal rights extended to us by the state? Okay, now the answer to that was, there was different answers to it. The answer in some respects was, realistically it looked as if the rights have to be protected by the state, so human rights are equivalent to legal rights. But that is not the only version. There are many people who argued that the human rights are larger than legal rights. Human rights are larger than legal rights. Having looked at the point that the human rights are larger than legal rights, let us look at the discrepancy between the idea of a human right as a norm or as a not, and the practice of human rights that is practiced, which is a fact. Now, there are people who argued that even if human rights are violated, even if state failed to guarantee the protection of rights that it gave, we can still talk about human rights. That is right, ought, even if it is not the case, because human rights are moral guarantors. They are the ones which will assure us the lot of things that will ensure our liberty, freedom, and right to property, freedom of speech, and things like that. Okay, so with this broad understanding of the discourse of human rights, let us look at some flawed understanding of human rights. The first criticism on human rights, and particularly on the practice of human rights, was the argument of inconsistency. Before the modern era, rights were established largely as the privileges of regional rulers conceded by monarchs. For example, you have the English Magna Carta of 1215 that sets out a hodgepodge of privileges claimed by English barons against the king. So the rights are not universal at that time. It is only some certain things which are conceded to some sections of people. Yeah. The other example is, although the 1689 Bill of Rights and the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen extended political privileges to more of the people, not merely the kings and kings, as is the case in the Magna Carta, women and other groups remained excluded. This remained as a very big, point of criticism for many people. So it is extended to many people, but it is not extended to women and other sections of people. So that was a limitation. As the Marquis de Condorcet argued brilliantly in 1790, a state that excludes women from political participation is a tyranny, and it claims to realize people's rights are simply inconsistent. So there are these inconsistencies where rights that are extended exclude on grounds of race and property to exclusion on grounds of criminal record and things like that. So this becomes a very serious problem. The other important issue with regard to the flawed understanding of human rights is incompleteness. There are instances in the history where women who struggled against the inconsistency of the French Declaration also demanded that it should contain more than civil and political rights. Thus, in her Declaration of Rights of Women, Olympes de Gorges called for equal rights in marriage and inheritance and right to education. And this is also the point that is strongly made by Mary Wollstonecraft in her book Vindication of Rights of Women. So both recognized that the Declaration of Rights that is limited to civil and political right is incomplete, and then they argued that they need to add other things like social and economic rights, and as I said, that it continues even today. The other important point with regard to the flawed understanding of human rights is, what is the relation between human rights and Western theories? Are human rights related to the Western value system? Okay, for instance, there is this Singaporean president Lee Kuan Yew who contended that individualism on which human rights are based are Western, and they eventually undermine the family values that are key to economic development in Asia. So for instance, in the Western paradigm, you find that human rights and liberty is related to the development of society. In Asia, there are people like you who would say that development is related to family values. Okay, and development that is related to family values gets undermined because you accept individualism, and individualism undermines family values, and which eventually would have its impact on development in Asian societies. This also gets reinforced by Amartya Sen, who who argues convincingly that there is no necessary relation between human rights and success in economic development. Political theorists like Jacques Donnelly looked at the relation between human rights and Western philosophy or Western thought more closely. They looked at how, for instance, the values of human rights are grounded in human nature and a particular aspect of human nature which is individualistic definition of human nature. So they argued that there is a close relation between human rights and the human nature that comes from Western modernity. Charles Taylor also argued that there are Western stereotypes that cannot define the concept of human rights if we hope to achieve an unforced intercultural consensus in support of human rights. So there are some other misconceptions about human rights. One is that, is individualism defining feature of human rights? Are human rights universal and practical? They would, for instance, somebody might ask this question, that if you are given a right to education or right to the well-being, okay, can it be met? Suppose if you don't meet what is offered to you, then should you consider that, namely right to well-being, as a right at all? But then the problem with this argument is, yes, they are not, but the problem is that there are also cases where civil rights are not protected by the state. So at that time, what do you do? Should we then, since they are not protected by the state, should we give them up? The answer obviously is no. The other issue that becomes very important in the discussions about human rights is, what is the relation between individualism and development? That we have just now discussed it with reference to Amartya Sen and Lee. Is development calls for the interference with other human beings. If it calls for interference or intervention from other human beings, then would that undermine the autonomy of individualism on which human rights rest? The other important point that is considered about the misconceptions about human rights is, suppose take this extreme case. The extreme case is that when you talk about human rights, as I said in the beginning, that human rights is largely related to universalism. Okay, but suppose you come across a situation where instead of excluding women and children from the domain of human rights, you have an entirely different kind of situation where that there are certain facilities, okay, and everybody is entitled for those facilities, and then there is a rider, namely women and children are entitled for a special access to these facilities. Now you are also saying that now they can access it more than other people. Does this amount to discrimination? Will it amount to violation of rights? So these are the things. So human rights works about along the axis of equality, individualism, development, various notions of practice and theory, the relation between the idea and the history of these ideas. All these things have been the major concern of human rights discourse. One of the important aspects of human rights is like some other applied areas, it is not only interests of academic value, it also has practical consequences. So when we discuss human rights, we have to be very careful about the conceptual clarity. We also have to factor the ground level realities. We also look at the relation between the idea and the reality. So we need to be more careful in discussing about human rights. Thank you.